So maybe you can first start off by taking us through your story and maybe your own conditioning and family history, what that looked like and how it motivated you to become a marriage and family counselor.
Sure. I'm an only child, and my parents, they got separated when I was in first grade and then went through a 9-year divorce process, which at the time was New Jersey's record, although I think it's been broken at this point. But I say that just because it was this very long and drawn out hostile process. And, as a kid, as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, and onwards, going through that experience, and especially as an only child, was something where I just became a very big observer of the system that was in front of me. And obviously didn't have that language and didn't even know what I was looking for at that age, but I was doing a lot of watching. And I started to recognize sort of my role within the family system was, as there was chaos and confusion and just a lot of arguing going on around me, my needs started to be met by my own self. And so certainly I had my major core basic needs met, but I just figured out how to handle everything that I needed on my own. And I put a lot of my attention and energy into just getting good at the things that I liked. So whether it was sports or music or language or whatever, fill in the blank, like I went and I did that and I put my time and energy into it. And I became what I used to call like sort of just an independent human. And then sort of like this very empowered, like independent woman is what it developed into. And I didn't understand the other side of that coin as an adult for a really long time, of what that independence really meant and what that was blocking and pushing away in my own life. But, it started from their divorce, and I was in a position where I knew I'd never wanted to go through a divorce myself. When you observe and you experience it that way, in the way that I did, like my pendulum swung and I was like, I never want this to happen to me. And I went into psychology in undergrad, and then I decided to go into marriage and family therapy in graduate school. From an unevolved place, it was, I never want to get divorced and I never want to go through what my parents went through, because I saw the impact that it had on them. And for them, it was different. My dad is Lebanese, and he at the time presented with a lot of anger and reactivity. He presented with a ton of gaslighting and manipulation. My mom was really emotional and was not able to like self-soothe and stabilize and keep up with the manipulation that my dad was putting out there. And so I just witnessed and observed all of this. And I wanted to safeguard my own life, my own relationships. And so I went to school for it. I was like, well, I'm going to learn all the tricks and tools and all the things. And the reality of it is there are no tricks and there is no bypassing of this work. There is a deep need to have a deep understanding of the self and of others and of our programming and our conditioning and what it was like growing up in our family systems and the role that we took on and all of the things, so that we can see why we do what we do and how we show up in our adult romantic relationships and how we do this beautiful healing work individually and relationally. So that's a mouthful. I'll pause there.
Yeah. Now that you did go through that and that your parents' divorce caused you to really be motivated to take on that role and step into your education there, do you feel like there is a really good time and place for divorce? I mean, I would assume your answer is yes, but that sometimes we give up too soon. Or what are your thoughts now on divorce?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there are absolutely times where separation and the end of the relationship is where the healing is. I think staying, or is your healing in the going? And I think a lot of times, like in our society and our world, our programming is that you get together and you stay together. That's the end all be all. And that is something that's conditioned within us to say hierarchically and superiorly, like that's the answer, is that you choose a relationship and then you do whatever you can to make it to the other side. And of course there's ebbing and flowing relationships. There's hard weeks, months, sometimes even years where we're having to really dive deep and get inwards with ourselves and others. But also sometimes our healing is in the leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we look over that. I think we like, oh, if you really loved each other, you would stay together. If you really meant your vows, then you would never turn your back. If you really this, there's a ton of shaming messages that can happen in that space. And, truly a lot of the times the healing that we have to do is by using our voice, taking a stand, stepping away from something that is maybe unhealthy or, a toxic dynamic or something that's abusive or just leaning into something that moves us away from the thing that is our pattern.
Yeah. And I noticed even in my own upbringing with divorced parents, my parents got divorced when I was 5, and I have several sisters. So I've kind of watched how that's affected all of us on completely different ends of the scale. Some, it's been to one side of the scale where they feel like, okay, I want to get married, but it's so important that I don't get divorced that I will stay in a unhealthy or toxic or codependent relationship far too long because I'm not getting a divorce. It becomes that mindset. Whereas then me, on the other hand, is like commitment is much more difficult for me because I don't even want to get into the place where I might have to make that decision, So yeah, I think the side that we can, as child of divorced parents, the thing we can work on most is how to reparent ourselves in the way that we would have wanted to be been through that.
I mean, I think that one of the questions and prompts is like, what do I tell myself if I do choose to leave, right? And so when you think about whether it's siblings or friends where you see them operating in a space where they're saying like, I'm unhappy, or like, I know that this isn't for me, but I can't go, like, I will not get a divorce. And it's like, well, what does divorce mean to you, right? What's the association, right? Is it failure? Is it, disappointment in the self? What is actually showing up in that space that we're resisting, right? That we're pushing away from, because there's so much that's attached and connected to what it means for us to get to that place. A lot of times it is failure, but if people are in that space listening in, thinking about, yeah, that's me, here's a prompt that might take you a little bit further to say, what am I actually resisting here? And then what's familiar about that?
Yeah.
Why does that cause so much disruption internally for me if I sit in that space of feeling like I'm failing something, feeling like I'm disappointed, somebody in my family system, let's say, or I'm the first divorce in the family that I know.
It's hard to know too when it's the relationship and when it's just your old patterns. Like you can feel like partners can come together and they can feel like they finally found the one and this is who they've always been waiting for, but yet they still both find reasons to not feel good. But it's not like actually the relationship. It's like something that they both have to deal with on their own. Yeah. So that's a slippery slope too.
It's a slippery slope. And part of it is that when we are doing our awakening work, right? Like when we are becoming aware of ourselves through our own introspection and exploration and reflections, and we trust that the other person is doing that too, right? Then we can begin to decipher between, whether it's our growth or whether it's our patterns, right? Because you're so spot on. And this is one of the things that people get so caught up around is like, how do I know if this is actually what I should be doing, whether this is my gut or whether this is my fear? And, I think a lot of times it's much more nuanced than this, and there's a lot of layers to it. But I generally think that when we're moving towards expansion, there is an internal peace that we are feeling, right? If we really listen in, if we really get connected with the self, and sometimes that can still be tricky because our nervous systems can do very interesting things. But I think when there is a deep sense of knowingness, there can oftentimes be a deep sense of peace that's also happening internally. And when there's that deep sense of fear and the unknown and patterns, a lot of times there's still contraction that's happening internally, that there's still chaos that is going on. And so obviously, again, this is nuanced, and so much of these answers come through deep diving work that we can do in therapy, for example. But I have generally found, at least in my own experience, when I've been trying to decide whether it's like my intuition and a deep sense of knowing versus, is this a pattern?
Yeah.
I can feel that difference internally when it's peace versus contraction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. If that's the case though, then there's a point where it should stop, right?
The chaos or the contraction.
Yeah.
Well, it at least tells you that there's more information there. Do you know, like if there's something that's happening, it's generally wanting more attention. And so it might mean that we're not asking it the appropriate questions, or we are turning away from it, with it. So yeah, there's definitely ways to deepen and enrich that work. But
And does this go into why we're attracted to who we're attracted to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously many theories out there. And one of the things that I do see to be true is that when we have, these unhealed parts, right, we tend to go down these paths of repetition or opposition. And so we can either be in a space of reenactments, right? So like we might find a partner with whom we can play out some of our wounding with. And it becomes this opportunity to try to quote unquote get it right, to try to heal together. Maybe with you, this person who seems to be distracted and prioritizing other things in the same way that my mother prioritized other things too. Maybe if I'm just good enough or important enough or special enough to you, you will be able to see that, and then we will be able to heal that, and I will become a priority for you. And so sometimes we go into that with blinders on and we don't know how to navigate that. Or we go down a path of opposition and we choose someone who looks nothing like the people who were part of our wounding or part of our trauma. And even though objectively, from the outside looking in, that might look nicer. So I'll give an example. If I had an alcoholic father, I may choose a partner who never wants to touch the stuff, right? And it's like, great, I'm never going to feel triggered in that space, and I don't have to worry about anything at all. Or maybe I grew up in a very conflict-focused household, and now I find a partner who never wants to, just doesn't argue about anything, is totally fine with everything, and we never get into fights. Great. From the outside looking in, that looks really nice. And so if we take a closer look, this path of opposition can sometimes still just swing that pendulum in the other direction, and there isn't actually integration. If we take the conflict example, if I've chosen a partner who never addresses conflict and is always okay and is sort of needless, nothing bothers them, they don't really have much to say about anything, they're always in a good place where, we're happy to disagree sometimes and that's all right, then what can happen in that space is there isn't this opportunity to move through conflict in a healthy way. So does that make sense? The sort of that swing of that pendulum, right? Where it's like, we often will repeat from, the subconscious place, or we'll go to this image and idea of what it ought to look like, but it's just us avoiding our triggers. And it's not actually feeling the wounding and the trauma that we have, and finding the way to navigate through it in what we call a path of integration, right?
Yeah.
It's
we haven't learned anything.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We have to be able to touch the wounds a little bit without ripping them open and destroying them.
Yeah.
We have to be able to touch them together, because if we're constantly in opposition land, then we're not actually doing the healing.
How do we know when we find the balance with a partner?
The integration? Yeah, usually it's because we are aware of ourselves. We can see the triggers. We are able to name them. We're able to talk about them. It doesn't mean that we never have activation. It doesn't mean that we never do things that betray the other or hurt the other or hurt the self. But I think it's that there is a space where both of us are willing to sort of pick up the things and look at them. And sometimes we can't do it in the moment. Sometimes it happens hours or days later, but that there is a practice of, okay, if we just had a tear in our relationship, then I know that there is something worth understanding and learning about myself and learning about you. And I always say that when it comes to conflict, that if we we can approach conflict from a space of saying, okay, flag in the sand. Obviously there's some energy here, but flag in the sand, because if we are in conflict, what this means is that there's something really important going on here for us. And if we can pause, which is hard to do, and there's a lot of skill that is necessary, but if we can pause in this space and understand what is happening in our inner world, right? So I have to get intimate with myself. What just happened? What just went on? What am I feeling internally? What is going on? What is familiar here? What do I know about this? And if you can do the same, what just happened for me, and like we do that work to go into our inner worlds, then we are going to learn something very important about ourselves and very important about the other person. And with that, we then have an opportunity to acknowledge, witness, understand, have a great sense of connection, closeness, and intimacy and togetherness with one another that can be very, very healing. So, conflict obviously is one of those things that's very hard for people because of all of the associations with it. But when we can see it as an opportunity, as a gateway for deep connection and intimacy, then we start to shift it and change it. But again, it's a practice of knowing how to go into that space with one another or with yourself.
Yeah. And how do we change what we're attracted to so that we can have that?
We can only really change what we're attracted to when we understand first why we're attracted to it, right? Like as much as it's why so many people find themselves in patterns, even though up here in their minds, they know, like, I keep going for the same type of person, or like, I don't want to keep going back to this person. And so we might know it intellectually, we might get it logically, practically, but when we haven't done our inner healing work, right? If we haven't addressed the wounds or the trauma, then we're going to find ourselves back in that space because it feels like a lifeline for us. We might say, I really want a partner who is XYZ, right? And it's honest and transparent and non-manipulative and like all these things that it's like, we're so clear on it and so obvious to us. And yet we find ourselves in that space. And so if we keep going back to something that our minds know is not right for us, it is the most beautiful indicator that we have not fulfilled on some type of healing work around trauma in our lives. Because that's what trauma does, right? It moves us into a space where we don't understand why we're doing something. It's not because we're dumb. We're not idiot, right? Like we're not stupid people walking around this world like, oh, this is fun. I really like doing this thing that hurts me. It's like, that's not it for the confused about like, why do I keep choosing people and how do I like wake up to this? What the arrow is pointing to is that there is something within you that still needs your attention, because you cannot change what you are attracted to until you heal something that is still yearning for the thing that you're trying to avoid.
Absolutely. And I think it almost yearns for a definition. This moment yearns for a definition of what chemistry actually means. Like we use that term, oh, well, I just did or didn't have chemistry with that person. But I think if the general population who's struggling with this looping pattern of, going back to either the same toxic partner or finding just another person to fill that same place and run the same old script with again. If we had a better definition of what chemistry actually means and why the chemicals in your body are reacting in a certain way because of the storyline, the pattern that you're talking to, we might have a better way to move through this and change our habit of going after someone who's going to inspire those chemicals.
Totally. I mean, I think a lot of times we confuse trauma bonds for chemistry.
Yeah.
I think it's like when we feel this like magnetism and we feel this deep sense of like, oh gosh, passion and energy and familiarity. I think a lot of times when we meet someone so quickly and we're like, whoa, you feel like home, or you're like, well, wait, home was really dysfunctional.
Right.
It's like, wait a sec, like what feels really familiar. And so it's why chemistry can feel very confusing to us, because we can very much be drawn into something right away that is actually going to be something that's potentially unhealthy for us. And that might be because of these trauma bonds, because trauma bonds will definitely go off of chaos sometimes. They'll go off of the conflict and the vibrancy between the two people. And so, yes, it's a great point of, just being aware of what is coming up for me and slowing that process down a little bit to know what is true and to see what's familiar about this. A lot of times relationships that are incredible start off really slow. They're like, you don't feel a chemistry really at all. And you're not sure, but you go again and you go again and you take another date. And over a little bit of time, we start to see that this is actually someone who we connect deeply with and where the attraction does start to build. And I think, unfortunately, as a society, we have hierarchically set up love, or the act of falling in love, to have superiority to it, that it should feel like fire and you should know right away. And if you're not like in love in those first few moments, then it's probably not it.
Right.
And the reality of it is that this act of falling in love looks so many different ways for everyone. And when we create this pinnacle of what it ought to look like, and then our story doesn't look like that at all, it's very confusing and disarming. If we're looking at movies, or if we're looking at television shows, or, friends who have said, oh, this is like how I fell in love. And that's the epitome of it. It's very hard to know how to place your own and to feel grounded in it when it looks dissimilar to that.
Yeah, we had someone on the other day who was an expert in kink and healing through sexual fetish and kink. So, someone might have a storyline that says, I need to be dominated, and maybe they had a daddy issue and someone who didn't make them feel safe, and so they need this superior figure. And through through consciously using sexual fetish or kink to create a safe setting that allows you to play out that story and have a positive reaction to it. Obviously, orgasm is sexual, have this validation that happens in that intimate of a setting is really cool, because it kind of, it came to mind because the way that we, like you're talking about, think about love being this thing that has to be in a split second. We are, love at first sight. We're having this Disney story play out. And that type of lust really is probably what that is very much tied to, well, yeah, if we played out that Disney story with the love at first sight and all that, and then it played out well and in our favor, and we're able to work through all those traumas like you're talking about together with this other person, fantastic. But we know that that is not how it always happens. So when we talked to this woman about using kink and fetish to consciously move through some of that as therapy, I thought that might be a better or more realistic option to what we're offering right now, to what you're talking about with the love at first sight stuff. I don't know, just another option or another route to use the chemistry that we feel with another person and work through it in a positive way, instead of lay it all like, oh, well, if I feel this feeling with someone, then I'm going to have to marry you and have kids with you, and then find out later that was just lust or some other.
Yeah, there are endless modalities of how we can do this healing work.
Yeah.
And I love how many different areas we can pick and choose from. And obviously this is so unique for each individual out there to think like, what is safe for me and what feels like a beautiful container for me to heal, and what's required for me to get into that space. And yeah, for some people it's talk therapy. For others, it might be hypnotherapy. For some, it might be a form of somatic work. For others, it might be this, very safe exploration through kink and power dynamics. For others, maybe it's using psychedelics, right? Like we're seeing so many people tap into these different modalities where we can really begin to connect to a deeper sense of healing. So I love that. I want to hear that podcast.
And get honest too. We have to get honest with what the feelings really are and what the chemicals really are. I think we only get to do that once we've done some of our own shadow work and figured out, like you're saying, the patterns are running. So I know we often tend to project the blame, our unhappiness in a relationship. Like basically when we're unhappy in a relationship, I know I've done this for most of my relationships. I find a way to blame it on my partner because I don't want to take the responsibility for it. And of course, that has often led to me thinking that the solution is to find a different partner, when now, I'm learning that is not the reality of the situation. I need to look at my own shit. But how is changing our partner not the answer often?
Yeah, right. Like it usually is not in that. It doesn't mean that there aren't
Right.
more aligned partners out there for us, because yes, that's probably true many times, but that if we do not do the work to understand what has linked me in this dynamic, then generally we will be drawn into the same thing again, right? So it may be absolutely 100% true that you are in a relationship that is unhealthy for you and dysfunctional for you. And so it still might be the right answer to leave that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But moving straight into another relationship without understanding more about the dysfunction or what has not felt healthy for you is generally going to wind up leading you to another dynamic that's going to play it out. And it might play it out in a different way, or the context of it might be a little bit different, but the familiarity of the wounding is still going to be the same until we happen to the wounding differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's why people, you often hear that like the lesson keeps showing up until until you change it, shift it in some way. And I think that is true when it comes to relationships as well. So yeah, it's very common. I hear a lot of people say like, I just need a new partner. And it's not, have I ever seen a new partner come in and hold different boundaries and, hold up a different mirror for someone else? Sure. I'm not going to say that it never happens and that, it's not out there. But I would say that the majority of the time when we're wanting to jump ship, what we're needing to do is hold up a mirror to ourselves to have a deeper understanding of what's going on there so that we can pivot and shift ourselves into a new type of dynamic.
Yeah.
So that I always say, make your pain wiser. And what I mean by that is like, if, we all have a story, we all have pain, we all have wounding, we all have, some type of trauma on the, on a spectrum, of course. But when we're going through life and relationships, it's like our pain must become wiser as it goes through all of the things. Like otherwise the pain just has to keep repeating over and over and over again until it wants to learn the lesson and it wants to speak up or set the boundary or do something a little bit different. And so, if we can begin to make our pain wiser, then we're not going to get the same quote unquote lessons over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's hard when I feel like when you have, I notice for me, I catch myself sometimes feeling like I have too much trauma to be in a healthy relationship because in the midst of conflict, my brain won't do what I want it to do. And then I later realize why did I go there? Why did I react that way? And so I get in this mindset of like, well, maybe you have too much trauma to like navigate through conflict in a healthy way because you just have so many patterns that you keep thinking you've undone until you're in the heat of the moment. And then you just, so it can be really frustrating. So I'm curious with that, the pain sentence that you said, your pain being wiser. Yeah. What would be?
We did interview someone recently who was an expert in the Gottman method, and they said 27 times of that type of practice would have to happen where you're in an instance where that old pattern arises and you recognize it and then reset in order for you to really feel confident in that.
Totally. I mean, I think that, Jade, this idea, like you're not too much, even when it feels like your patterns are in your driver's seat and you're not. And those moments can feel very overwhelming. And I think a lot of times the narratives for any of us who've ever been in the position that you're describing right now is like, it's like, can I be loved this way? Does anybody want to deal with like something that can feel so heavy to us? Yeah. And, I know I've questioned when I feel like I'm in a position like that, my narratives were like, am I actually lovable? Like, and I don't really feel worth deserving of love when this is what's showing up. Yeah. Now I'm able to separate that out a little bit from like the bigger story of, am I deserving of love and am I worthy of love? Like, yes, I believe that, right? But I think when these moments happen, one of the things that shoots in immediately is like, oh, like yuck, like I really am unlovable in this moment. This is a lot. Yikes. And like when I see myself, mine probably looks different than yours, but like mine is when I can be in conflict and I need to prove my point and I double down and I can get vicious and like, and I can move into this space and I can observe myself doing it, but I don't stop myself from doing it. And then I'm like hand over mouth, oh my God, gross. Like this is, no one wants to be around this. No one wants to love someone like this. And those moments are so hard to climb out of because it's so true. Like we feel it. We're like, gosh, yeah, that's yucky. That's not something that I feel proud of. I know I don't feel proud of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're in partnership right now or not, but I think it's, when we're in this space where we're committed to doing this work, even though we don't have it all figured out, even though sometimes it gets really, really heavy, which it does. I don't think, one, that we're ever finished products. And I also don't think that we need to be finished products to date or be in relationship. I think what we should have is a willingness to look at ourselves if we're going to be in relationship, right? If there were ever a prerequisite to dating, like, how do I know that it's okay for me to date or be in relationship? Like if you're at least willing to do your work, like be willing to look at yourself even when it's hard, but do not set the bar that we need to be without trauma or that our trauma needs to be healed before, because a lot of times, in my opinion, we can only do so much individually. And this is not like preaching for codependency at all. So for anybody who's like, you don't need another person to do anything. It's like, actually, again, I know it's my opinion, but I believe that when it's relationships that wound and are a part of creating trauma, then it's relationships that we need in order to have healing and to heal the trauma, right? It's like we can go very far into it on our own, but at the end of the day, I think we need the mirror in front of us, and we need this container with other individuals in it with whom we can have those hard conversations or conflict where you can't change your operating system and you do the old thing, but that person stands side by side with you and they know why that's hard for you. And they maybe hold that space. And obviously we need there to be safety, and it's not a dangerous environment, and it's not about allowing abuse to happen, but it is to hold that space as we try to navigate this together, because I have certainly felt that with a witness who loves me as I do my healing work, that has been a beautiful motivation for me. And it has sometimes felt like the container for me to meet some of these parts and continue that deep healing work. So I know that was a big mouthful.
No, that's awesome. And I think that when you do feel like your trauma has changed your brain to not work the way you want it to, that's a self-loathing. And then what you said, okay, but I'm willing to look at it, that's self-love. So
beautiful.
So that's really good.
And it's also love to the other. Like I am willing to look at it for me, and I'm also willing to look at it for you. I don't like harming myself. I don't like harming you. I don't like, we don't love doing that. And so when I am willing to take an honest look at myself, and you're willing to take an honest look at yourself, then we have a possibility to start to change some of those, like the wiring. That's what's so beautiful about neuroplasticity, is that we can rewire and reroute. And even when we've been doing something a certain way for years, decades, I know it can feel overwhelming, but the reality of it is that we can. I think right now, this time in our history of the world with everything that's going on, I've been paying attention to the programming and the operating system that's getting updated as we speak right now. The fact that I don't pay that close attention to how often I used to wash my hands or touch my face, and all of a sudden I am aware of it because something big enough is happening for me to wake up to it. It's just a simple example. Like every time I want to go, I'm like, nope, not going to touch my face. And what happened? We have there's something very serious that's going on. But bam, look at the programming. Look at how people are starting to shift. All the things we said we can't do, we are beginning to do. Right. And so I just use that as like this moment in time where we are being shown right directly in front of us that we can update operating systems like that if we need to.
Right.
So
and
that's true for us.
Unfortunate to have to hit rock bottom sometimes in order to do it. It's frustrating, but that's a part of the human condition. I'm hoping one day we will, part of this paradigm shift that's happening right now with COVID-19 is, I think we're going to see that kind of wane to, okay, how can we be a little more preventative instead of just reacting,
Yeah.
And to your point earlier about how we can rewire our brains and our perspective can change. I just wanted to bring up a quote from your page that you say, you cannot change someone else. What you change is how you relate to them, not changing. So I just thought that was a beautiful quote to what you were speaking about there. But I do want to ask you, when we're talking about all this growth that we do, being introspective people, you know, trying to be as healthy as we can in relationship, when is it the right time to leave a relationship though?
Yeah, I mean, it's very nuanced, obviously, for all of us, and you know, there's no guidebook for it. But I do think that when there is complete resistance from another person, or you see them unwilling to do any of their own individual work, you know, obviously the amount of time that we're willing to hold in that space is up for us to decide. But I think in the shutdown, in the resistance we have, I know you had somebody on who does a lot of the Gottman work, but you know, in his research, in their research, Julie and John, you know, the 4 relationship killers are defensiveness, criticism, contempt, and stonewalling. And so when those things are constantly there, it's not about them being there sometimes. We all do all of them.
Yeah.
But if those are things that are constantly present in a relationship, and a person cannot look at themselves and just is living in denial, and there's just a constant form of manipulation and gaslighting, you know, can those people ever change? Sometimes, right? But I think part of our work is to see who is in front of me right now. And, you know, it's interesting, right? Because where we are in this conversation right now sort of loops us back to, but I'm like, what our commitments are, you know, the conversation we were having earlier is like, but I promised in my vows to never leave, or I can never get a divorce, or I committed to this person. So even though they are manipulating or gaslighting or being abusive, like that, I still need to stay because, you know, I signed on the dotted line. And so obviously, you know, everybody is having to make very important decisions for themselves, and there's many layers to it. I think when we talk about this, a lot of people are like, well, what about if you have children, or they're going through a very serious like trauma in their lives and this is not who they are? And like, there can be all of these asterisks that present for all of us, right? And at the end of the day, I think, you know, we are meant to feel expansive in relationships, and at least we're meant to feel that way the majority of the time. It does not mean that we never contract. It does not mean that we never feel disconnected from people. The reality of it is that we do. But when the majority of the time you are in contraction, meaning you are having to abandon yourself in order to meet the needs of another, you know, I think like becoming less of yourself, right? That change is about expansion, coming further into yourself, versus change that makes you abandon you in order to make the system still operate. I think if you have been in a pattern for a long time where you have needed to abandon yourself in order to keep the relationship afloat, that certainly is something that requires your attention. You know, I'm not ever here, obviously, to make a decision or a call on a person's relationship, but I would say that for our mental health and our overall health, we want our relationships to feel generally expansive, and that it should never have us abandoning ourselves in it. You know, I think this quote is an important one, right? Where we trade authenticity, right? We trade authenticity for attachment. And we learn that really early on when we're children, right? What do we do? What do we begin to do? Oh, I'm fine. I'm totally happy. I don't need anything, mom, just so that mom stays happy. Like, what do we do? What do we leave? What do we give up about ourselves in order to make sure that the system stays okay? And when we're having to do that in our adult romantic relationships and really thinking like, what am I trading in? What am I not being authentic about? What am I afraid? If I were authentic, what would happen? If I was transparent right now, if I spoke my mind, if I said what I needed to say, what am I afraid will happen? And if you answer that question honestly, well, my partner will listen to it. We'll be able to move through it. Or my partner would leave me in a second, or it would turn into a conflict, or they would become vicious and mean towards me. Like, what's that answer? Right? Because if you are holding things back in significant ways in your relationship as the effort to maintain its stability, then the relationship needs attention, very serious attention, because that is not something that can maintain itself for a long period of time.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice there. And what I'm hearing you say is that when our growth is discouraged by our partner or by by being in this relationship, then that's definitely a red flag of this probably isn't the right place for you. And
well, a
also,
lot of times, sorry, I was just going to say that a lot of times growth in us feels really threatening to others.
yeah.
Where are you going to grow to?
Right,
where
right.
are you, seriously, like, where are
Yeah.
you leaving me for? Right. And I think a lot of times when growth feels threatening to someone else, it may be because they are resistant to
Yeah.
growth, right?
That's where it gets into narcissism, and it gets into a lot of, the resistance.
Yeah.
But you can't change a person. All you can do is your own stuff and hopefully be the light. Maybe they'll see that you're doing really well in that growth and follow along in whatever way they need to explore theirs. What you brought up there, though, about attachment and us losing ourselves in our
authenticity.
Yeah, in our relationships brings to mind something you've written also. So I'm going to quote you again. You said, losing yourself in an attempt to keep someone else is one of the greatest abandonments of our time. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that just really struck me as something that I have definitely done where, I jump into a relationship and I completely disregard all the things I was previously interested in for this person's interest. And, I lose myself in it. And I've seen that happen for a lot of my friends and family as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we have the fear of abandonment or the fear of not being chosen or not being good enough, which is such in the collective, it's like so many of us have that fear. And so when that is there and it's in the driver's seat, then we will do anything, even abandon ourselves, right? We'll do anything to hold on to it. We want to keep it at all costs. And that piece it's important to acknowledge. And even if that's all we can do right now in this moment as a listener is acknowledge that, like, yes, indeed, that is what I do.
Yeah.
It again points us to where our healing work needs to be, right? Is like, you don't have to be complete in this space, right? As we've said already, all we need to do is be willing to look. So if you're listening, you're like, gosh darn, I do that. I do not want to be left. And so I cling to something at the expense of myself.
For sure.
Okay. Yeah. Like, all right, raise the hand and be gentle in that space with yourself. But then like a little bit of a nudge to say, what do I need to look at? Because usually it's in response to something that has previously happened in our lives that has placed a fear there for us to begin with. Right?
For sure.
Whether it's an abandonment, whether it's never being chosen as a child, not feeling good enough. Right? So it may not be those things for you, but I would ask you to consider, like, what do I have to trade and what do I abandon in order to try to keep people in my life? Who do I have to be? Who do I have to become? How do I have to show up? What are the things that I have to say? What do I have to look like? What do I need to do? How do I have to pretend in order to keep you? And get really honest with those questions.
I'm curious
and
because
faces parts of yourselves.
Sorry, you froze up. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that also, yes, that's the work I definitely need to apply more. I mean, I've come a long way, I've obviously been recognizing some of this in myself for a while now, so I've come a long way, but I still see places where I lose myself. And I guess you've kind of answered how we reverse that. We recognize it in the first place, but then doing the work, or how do we exactly apply that? Maybe I just want a more straightforward path.
Like, how do we apply?
Once we've recognized, okay, here's how I'm not being authentic to myself and I am losing myself in this relationship because of these abandonment things, and maybe I'm digging up the real core stories probably from my childhood that tell me I'm not worthy or not worthy of being authentically me because someone might leave me if I am, or that's my worry. Now, how do I use that in my relationships or how do I use that knowledge to not get lost?
Yeah. So the knowledge must also be met with grieving, right?
Okay.
So before we can just apply it, right? Where it's like, okay, I've had this moment and I now know this part about my life and the origin story. Okay. I went into my family system. I see it. Here's the pattern, yada, yada, yada. Boom. Here's how it's showing up present day. What makes it very hard almost near impossible to just shift it with the information is because we haven't felt fully enough. Right? A lot of times we are collectors of all of this wisdom and understanding in moments that we have along the way, and then we want to apply them without grieving what it felt like as a child, grieving what it's felt like all alone, feeling into that trauma, having somebody witness that with us. That's why therapy, with the right person can be a really powerful experience, because there's a space to release. There's a space to,
Yes.
Mercedes, I think you said before, like the inner child healing work, right? Is like, and that self-parenting, right? Is like, there is work that needs to be done between I've identified something in my childhood and now I'm seeing it and trying to connect the dots in my adult life. And what I would say is the missing link is that I have not felt enough. I have not grieved enough. I have not, and whatever grief looks like for you, but it might be like, I need to sob for myself, or I might need to sob in the arms of, a friend. That like there needs to be something that happens. Otherwise, we are not feeling what needs to be felt, and then we cannot apply what it is that we know.